My name is Alexei, and I spent the majority of my life working as a forester in the remote, unforgiving wilderness of the Yugva National Park in central Russia. It is a place where the wild beauty of nature meets a haunting silence that is both mesmerizing and ominous. Covering nearly 19,000 square kilometers, Yugva is home to dense boreal forests stretching tundra, and a landscape that feels as though it could swallow a person whole without a trace. In the late 1980s, as a young forester, I was sent to work in this isolated part of Russia. At the time, there wasn't much tourism in Yugva, save for the families of Red Army soldiers who occasionally visited to enjoy a rare moment of peace. However, one summer day in 1987, a strange incident forever altered my view of the forest. It was high summer, the peak of our busiest season. One afternoon, while walking along a wooded trail, I heard someone shout my name from behind. Turning, I saw a man, dressed in a dark military uniform, hurrying toward me. His face was tense, eyes filled with urgency. As he reached me, his words spilled out in an angry rush. "You there! Forester! Come here!" he barked. I had learned the ways of the military well, having spent time in the army before becoming a forester. It didn't take long to recognize his posture and tone. This man was an officer, an angry one at that. Behind him his family trailed, each looking utterly disturbed. His wife held their young son and daughter close, their eyes wide with fear. They had clearly witnessed something that had rattled them to their core. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The officer was livid. "Some crazy man has been stalking us in the woods. He came right up to us while we were eating and just stared. At first, he did nothing, but when I went to confront him, he ran toward us, as if he wanted to harm us. My wife was terrified. My children screamed in fear. I asked for a description, and he hesitated before speaking again, his voice filled with disgust. He was tall, wearing furs, a maniac, but the worst part, he was wearing a hat made from a bear's head, like some kind of savage. The more I listened, the stranger it all sounded. But then the officer added something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. When I approached him, he didn't run. Instead, he charged at us like some kind of animal. He stopped just before I could act. He laughed at the fear he caused. It was unnerving. I immediately started to doubt the officer's version. Maybe it was just a drunken hunter, or perhaps a local gone mad. But the officer was insistent. He wasn't a hunter. He didn't carry a weapon. He was dangerous. He needs to be found. That evening, after the encounter with the officer, I joined one of my colleagues, Dmitri, in a search for the mysterious man. We weren't sure what to expect. The officer had painted a picture of a wild man, someone who seemed more like a character from a folklore tale than a real person. But one thing was clear, something had frightened that family, and we needed to find out what it was. We climbed into our old UAZ 469, which we affectionately called the Goat. No luxury, but it got the job done. The journey through the dense forest was long, and despite the ruggedness of our vehicle, it didn't take away the eerie feeling that clung to the air. The sun had started to dip behind the tree line, and the park, once vibrant, now seemed to hum with a quiet tension. We followed the officer's directions, but the deeper we went into the woods, the more unsettling it became. No signs of human presence, no remnants of campfires or equipment that might suggest the man had been there. There were only the sounds of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. As we ventured further into the wilderness, the silence around us became more oppressive. Hours passed with no sign of the mysterious man. It felt as though the forest was hiding him, its deep, shadowed heart swallowing any traces of life that dared enter. By the time dusk had fallen, our hope of finding him had dwindled, but we pressed on, determined not to return empty-handed. As nightfall embraced the woods, we made one final push. That's when we found it, a small trinket hanging from a low branch, almost like it had been placed there intentionally, almost ceremonially. It was a small bird skull, tied with a thread of twisted twigs. Dmitri, who was more familiar with folklore than I was, recognized it immediately. "That's an oba," he muttered under his breath, his face grim. "A charm, a warning." A strange chill ran down my spine. I'd heard of such things. Spiritual trinkets used by ancient cultures to ward off evil or to invoke curses. But this wasn't just folklore. We were holding something real in our hands, something tied to the very land we were walking on. We found more as we ventured further, strange markings, twisted symbols carved into tree trunks, small animal bones hanging from branches. It felt like we were crossing into a territory not meant for outsiders. Territory claimed by someone or something with a deep connection to the forest, someone who didn't welcome our intrusion. It was then that I realized we were no longer simply searching for a man who had frightened a family. We were searching for something far more dangerous. The bear man had left these signs behind, and they were telling us in no uncertain terms that we were trespassing. As we continued our search, the forest seemed to close in on us. The trees grew denser, and the air thickened with an almost tangible presence. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. We were being watched. The night grew colder as we pressed forward, the darkening forest seemingly swallowing any traces of light. The small trinkets, charms, seemed to increase the deeper we went, and each one we found added to the growing unease that had settled in my chest. Dmitri and I were now moving cautiously, our steps measured, as though every sound we made was being scrutinized. The eerie stillness of the forest had shifted into something far more unsettling, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. At one point, Dmitri stopped dead in his tracks. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward a group of tall pines. There, on the ground, was a large patch of disturbed earth, almost as though something or someone had been dragged through the underbrush. We knelt to inspect the area, and the feeling of dread that had been building in my stomach intensified. The ground was broken, freshly dug with strange marks, long claw-like gouges etched into the soil. It was not the work of an animal, but something far more deliberate. The signs were undeniable. This was the territory of the bear man, and we had entered it fully. Suddenly, a rustling sound cut through the air, followed by a low, almost imperceptible grunt, a noise so unnatural that it made my skin crawl. It came from behind a cluster of thick bushes, too close for comfort. Dmitri held up a hand, signaling me to stay still, and for the first time that evening my nerves kicked in. Every muscle in my body screamed to turn and run, but we stayed frozen, listening. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, through the dense underbrush, I saw movement. It was a figure, tall, wearing something that resembled the remains of an animal pelt. At first I couldn't make out the details, but then, as the figure shifted slightly, I saw it clearly. The man wore a headpiece crafted from the skull of a bear, its hollow eyes staring out through the darkness. The rest of him was obscured, wrapped in furs, blending seamlessly with the environment. He stood motionless, as though waiting for us to notice him. Dmitri and I were both paralyzed in place. The air between us thickened with an unspoken understanding. We weren't dealing with a mere hunter or madman. This man was something different, something wild, something that belonged to the forest itself. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, the bear man moved. His motion was fluid, almost animalistic, as he melted back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had come. The only trace of him was the faint echo of his laugh, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Dmitri looked at me with wide eyes, his face pale, as though he too realized the gravity of what we had just witnessed. "That was him," Dmitri whispered, his voice barely audible. "The man in the bear's head." I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. We hadn't been prepared for this, for the reality of what we were up against. We had thought we were searching for a man lost in madness, but now we knew this was something far darker. We quickly made the decision to return to the headquarters, but as we retraced our steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't leaving the forest. The forest was letting us go. We were no longer in control. This was no longer our world. It was his. We made our way back to the old UAZ, moving quickly and cautiously, as though the shadows themselves were closing in around us. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness, amplifying the sense of dread that clung to the air. The further we walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the forest had quieted in anticipation, watching us with the same intensity we had witnessed in the bear man. Every rustle of a branch, every snap of a twig beneath our boots, seemed to carry a weight that made it impossible to shake off the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the UAZ, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The engine roared to life, but the sound did nothing to chase away the tension in my chest. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure of the bear man in the distance, silently trailing us through the woods. But there was nothing. Just the trees, standing as they always had still, unyielding, like sentinels watching over a secret world. We drove back to headquarters in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over. What had we really seen? A man? A spirit? A legend brought to life? None of it made sense, and yet the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this man, this creature, was tied to the land. He didn't simply live in the forest. He was the forest, a part of its dark, hidden heart. At the headquarters, the night felt heavier. The usual sounds of the camp, the crackle of a fire, the chatter of fellow foresters, seemed distant, as if we had crossed some invisible boundary that separated the known world from the unknown. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on us as we walked in. We had seen something they hadn't, and the weight of that knowledge hung in the air between us. I reported our findings to our boss, but he was skeptical. He had heard similar stories before, tales of wild men and strange encounters, but nothing ever came of them. They were always written off as the products of overactive imaginations, especially in such remote places. But I could see the hesitation in his eyes when I mentioned the bear man's laughter. The way he moved like an animal. The sense of knowing that had been present in the encounter. My boss, a seasoned forester, knew that the wilderness had its own rules, ones that could not always be explained by logic or science. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, the wind stirring the trees, the calls of nocturnal creatures in the distance. And yet, even those sounds seemed far away, muffled by the presence of something darker. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bear man's face, the dark eyes of the bear skull staring back at me. The next morning, we set out again, this time with a larger group of foresters, determined to find the bear man and resolve whatever madness had taken root in that part of the forest. Our boss had reluctantly agreed to send us back into the woods, though he was still skeptical. Armed with rifles and a stronger sense of purpose, we made our way back to the area where Dmitri and I had encountered the bear man. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. Every step seemed to take us further away from the world we knew and deeper into something ancient, something forgotten. It felt as though the forest itself was pushing back against our presence, as if we were intruding on a sacred, forbidden place. Hours passed, And still, there was no sign of the bear man. The forest remained as it always had, silent, watchful, waiting. We began to think that maybe we had been mistaken, that our encounter had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a fevered imagination playing tricks on us in the dark. But then, just as we were about to turn back, we found something. A clearing, nestled in the heart of the woods, where the trees seemed to part in a wide arc, like the entrance to some forgotten temple. At the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any I had ever seen. It was massive, ancient, its bark gnarled and twisted, as though it had grown in the darkness for centuries. And hanging from its branches, more charms, hundreds of them, animal bones, bird skulls, woven threads, all in a chaotic array as though someone had spent years collecting them and placing them there. In the center of it all, there was a single object that caught my eye. A bear skull, its empty eyes staring into the distance, just like the one we had seen the night before. This was no coincidence. We had found his lair. But before we could process what we had discovered, a voice echoed through the clearing. "Leave now, or suffer!" It was a voice low and guttural, not quite human. It sent a chill down my spine, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But we stood frozen, our eyes locked on the bear skull, as if it were watching us, judging us. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again, tall, hunched, wearing the same bear skull. But this time it was different. He wasn't just standing in the shadows. He was coming toward us. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the figure stepped forward from the shadows. The man, or whatever he was, moved with a fluidity that was both unnatural and terrifying. His dark fur cloak rustled with each step, and the bear skull on his head seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its empty eye sockets fixed on us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the adrenaline coursing through me, but my legs refused to move. We were paralyzed, caught between the presence of something ancient and the instinct to flee. The man's eyes, human yet not, burned with an intensity that sent a shiver through my spine. There was no mistaking it now. This was no drunken hunter, no mad hermit. This was a force of nature, something that had claimed the forest as its domain, and we had dared to trespass. His voice cut through the stillness again, low and rasping. "You are not welcome here." My heart raced, my breath coming in short gasps. I knew the danger we were in. We had entered a place that was not ours to understand. But we were rangers, trained to protect, to face the wilderness without fear. I forced myself to stand tall, to meet his gaze, even as my instincts screamed at me to run. "We are here to protect this land," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You are the one who trespasses, not us." The bear man laughed, the sound like the growl of a wild animal. "Protection?" he echoed, stepping closer, his face now illuminated by the pale light filtering through the trees. "You do not protect. You destroy. You cut down the trees. You kill the animals. You are part of the sickness that plagues this land." His words struck me like a blow. He spoke with a conviction that cut deeper than any weapon. The weight of his words lingered in the air, suffocating me with the realization that he was right. We were part of a system that took from the forest, that changed it, that destroyed it in the name of progress. And in that moment I wondered if this man, this force of nature, was the forest's way of fighting back. "We only protect what is ours," Dmitri spoke up, his voice steady despite the terror that I knew gripped him. "We don't want to harm the forest. We want to keep it safe." The bear man tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can protect what you do not understand?" Before either of us could respond, the air around us seemed to crackle, charged with energy. The trees seemed to sway, even though there was no wind. The ground beneath our feet trembled, just slightly, as though the earth itself was waking up. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The bear man took a step back, his face hardening into something unreadable. "Leave this place," he said, his voice no longer threatening but final, as though the decision had already been made. We stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The weight of his words hung in the air, and the unsettling presence of the forest seemed to press in on us from all sides. Finally, Dmitri nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. Without a word, we turned and began to walk back toward the UAZ. We didn't run, but we didn't look back either. The bear man's gaze burned into the back of my skull, and I knew that this encounter had changed everything. As we reached the vehicle, I could feel the tension lift just a little, but it was replaced by something else, a nagging feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something much darker. Something that lived in the heart of the forest, watching, waiting. We returned to headquarters, our minds heavy with the events of the day. The others were curious, but didn't ask too many questions. They could see it in our faces. We didn't need to speak. They knew we had encountered something we couldn't explain, something that went beyond our training, beyond the world we had grown up in. The days that followed were uneventful, but the memory of the bear man and the chilling warning he had given us stayed with me. The forest felt different now, darker, more alive with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And every so often when I would venture back into the woods for my patrols, I would catch glimpses of something in the distance, a shadow moving between the trees, a flicker of movement that felt too deliberate to be an animal. I never saw the bear man again, but I could feel his presence, and I knew, deep down, that he was always watching, waiting. As the seasons changed and the snow began to fall, I couldn't help but wonder if we had done enough. Had we truly protected the forest, or had we merely delayed the inevitable? The bear man, the charms, the strange power that seemed to pulse through the land, these were things that would linger long after we were gone. And so I left the forest eventually, leaving behind the life I had known. But even now, as I walk the busy streets of the city, I hear the rustle of trees in the wind, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere deep in the heart of the wilderness, the bear man still waits.